Well, what's up, everybody? I hope you've had a phenomenal week. The weekend is now upon us, and there's few left in the summertime, so get out and enjoy it while you can. Last Saturday, I did an episode related to the subject: Is the modern secular state of Israel holy? And I answered with an affirmative yes. Okay, and this picked up where Pastor Brett and I left off in our prophecy update at Athey Creek a couple weeks ago. Now, I used a story from the book of 1 Samuel about the corruption of the two sons of the high priest Eli. Eli was one of the final judges of the era known as the judges. Samuel is actually the final judge. Okay, he stands at the frontier between the two eras of the judges and the monarchy. Okay, the monarchy, just so you know, is also referred to as the First Temple period because it was during that time under the reign of Solomon that we, the Jews, built our first temple. So in the story last week, we talked about Eli, who not only was a judge, but also functioned as the high priest, and his two corrupt sons who brought the disfavor of God upon the whole nation. Okay, not only were the two sons slain and the family of Eli to be cursed forevermore because of this, okay, because of the corruption of his two sons. Now, what was the actual corruption? If you recall, they showed disdain or contempt to the sacrificial system that God had put in place there by commandeering the choice pieces of meat, or let's say the pieces of meat that are meant to go to Yahweh himself to be sacrificed to him, and they would commandeer these choice pieces of meat for themselves. Okay, and in doing so showed contempt for the holiness of the sacrificial system. Now, I use this story to show you that at a time when Israel itself was backslidden, not holy in behavior, God still considered the nation of Israel to be holy. If you recall, the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines who dwelled in Gaza, okay, at the war between them and Israel. It took place at a site called Ebenezer. Okay, from that we get in much later literature the name Ebenezer Scrooge. Okay, Ebenezer meaning in Hebrew the rock of help. Okay, none of that matters for now. What matters is that the Ark of the Covenant was captured. The Philistines, having defeated the Israelites and captured the Ark, got high and mighty and interpreted their victory over Israel as the victory of their God Dagon over the God of Israel, Yahweh. Now, we talked about this fine line that Yahweh walked back then as well as today, that fine line between disciplining his own people, us, the people of Israel, and at the same time not letting the enemies of Israel interpret that to mean that God himself is weak, okay, or that Yahweh is not God. And therefore, he had to reprove them also. Okay. And he did so in the story of the tumors or hemorrhoids breaking out in each city's population, where the Ark of the Covenant toured, if you remember, the 5 cities of the Philistines, again, being Gaza City, Ashdod, Ashkelon. In each place that the Ark was taken and shown off as sort of this victory over Yahweh, well, Yahweh made sure the Philistines did not too long continue to remain high and mighty, striking them with tumors, okay? And all this to show them that he is still holy, okay? The God of Israel is holy. The nation of Israel is holy, even while in a backslidden state. Okay, so I use that story from 1 Samuel to argue that even when Israel is secular, for lack of a better word, like it is today, it doesn't take away from the fact that God has set that nation apart as his chosen vessel. That's all that word holy or kadosh in Hebrew means. It means to be set aside by the God of the Bible for his purposes. Now, sometimes that object or person or group of people is being set aside acts holy, okay, looks holy, but sometimes, as is the case with Israel throughout most of our history, we're not acting holy. And yet none of that takes away from the fact that God has set us aside as his everlasting chosen vessel through which to reveal himself to the world. Okay. And I argued last week, as I'll argue again and again and again, that there is no greater sign on earth in the last 2,000 years. There's been no greater sign. Nothing surpasses the modern day rebirth of a Jewish state and the modern day regathering from the four corners of the earth to that state of the world's Jewish populations as the state of Israel is. Okay, in other words, no greater sign proves the accuracy of the Bible, its inspiration by the Spirit of God, its seal of supernaturalness, okay? And I can go on and on hyperbolating here, but you know what I'm trying to say? Nothing proves the Bible more. There is no greater exhibit of the accuracy and faithfulness of Scripture than the rebirth of the modern state of Israel and its miraculous battles, or let's say its miraculous victories in battles against forces that far outnumbered, as was the case this past June in the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, okay, in which the very opening minutes of the war saw miracles on par with anything that we read in the Bible of God's supernatural delivery of the Jews in ancient wars against their ancient enemies. Ditto for the pager attack, okay, several months ago. Likewise, against the personnel or the fighters of Hezbollah. Okay, so that was last week's subject. Is the secular Jewish people, and moreover, the secular Jewish state of Israel, holy even in a backslidden state? And the answer is yes, because the holiness is derived from our standing before God, not necessarily our manifesting holiness in our behavior. Okay, now this week we're going to stay in the first book of Samuel to explore further a subject, or let's say another subject, that Pastor Brett and I raised in that prophecy conference. And that's the issue of the many messiahs of Israel. Okay, I raised this issue with Brett at the prophecy conference. It had potential to stumble people because both Jew and Gentile have always believed that there's only one Messiah of the Jewish people. Okay, the Messiah that most Jews are still waiting for it to come, or the Christians, of course, already believe came in the form of Jesus. In other words, what we call the eschatological or end times Messiah. Okay? Jews and Gentiles alike believe that that's the only Messiah mentioned or referred to in the Bible. But I raised this issue and told Pastor Brett in the audience, who were there at Athey Creek, that Israel has had many messiahs, many dozens of messiahs, starting with King Saul. And the reason is because that very term Messiah is really just a synonym for whoever is the king of Israel. It's basically the synonym for king of Israel. King is Melech in Hebrew, okay? That's literally king, like the word Nasi would mean president today, okay? But Mashiach, from which we get the English word Messiah, is basically a synonym for king, because each successive king of Israel was considered to be the Messiah of that time. Okay, in other words, God's anointed for that time, starting with King Saul, who we'll spend the bulk of today on, okay, the bulk of this episode on, followed by King David, who's the second Messiah of the Jewish people, followed by his son, King Solomon, who's the third Messiah of the Jewish people, followed by Solomon's son Rehoboam, who's the fourth Messiah, in his case only over the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, okay, because this is now after the split of Israel into two distinct kingdoms. Each one of these people in the Bible is referred to in the Hebrew as God's Messiah or anointed. Now, for those of you who read the Bible in English, you never come across the word Messiah as it relates to any of these people. Why? Because when the Christians translate the Bible into their various English versions, they don't want to confuse their readers into thinking, my gosh, this guy Saul's a Messiah and David's a Messiah and Solomon's a Messiah. Wow, what do we do? Okay, we thought Jesus is the Messiah, and now you're claiming there's all these other Messiahs. Okay, to translate the Hebrew word Mashiach to Messiah every time it appears in the books of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings would sow confusion among the Christians reading the Bible, okay, because of what I said a few minutes ago, the notion there's only one Messiah, that being Jesus. So what the Christian translators of the Bible do is every time the word Mashiach appears in the Hebrew account, they render it to anointed. Okay, so every time you come across the word anointed in English in the Hebrew Bible, or what you guys typically call the Old Testament, it really says in Hebrew the word Messiah. Okay, and that's very important, and I want to get into that today. I want to develop it a little because ultimately it reveals a lot about Jesus, okay, and what Jesus has to do, what's part and parcel of Jesus's messianic calling on his life, okay? The Christians would argue that the Jews of history have this incredible blind spot as it relates to Jesus' first coming. But I've argued in previous episodes that there's very few passages in the Bible that deal with Jesus' first coming. Yes, there's maybe a dozen, okay, or so, but most of them are pretty cryptic with the exception of Isaiah 53, which I'll admit is as in your face as you can get and played a huge role in my own coming to the faith, okay? So I'm not taking anything away from that. And I also argued a few weeks ago that Zechariah chapter 12, okay, those passages that refer to Jesus' second coming, when it says of us, the Jews, that we will mourn him, the one we pierced, okay, that too is pretty, to me, obvious, okay? Definitely not cryptic, as I've argued many other passages are. Now, what would I give as an example of a cryptic passage regarding Jesus? Well, let's say the earliest one in the Bible is the one back in Genesis referring to the serpent being crushed by the foot of the seed of Adam, but the serpent having bruised the heel of the person, this descendant of Adam, before being crushed. I think you know which verse I'm referring to. I forget the exact verse number in my head here. I'm just speaking off the cuff. It's not in front of me. But that's accepted by almost all Christians as being the very first prophecy related or foretelling the first coming of Jesus as that suffering servant, as in the heel being bruised, but then ultimately crushing the serpent or crushing Satan victoriously as he's arisen from the cross. But that's pretty cryptic. In other words, nobody reading this, no Jewish person reading this without knowing Christian theology would ever see that in that particular verse. Okay, in other words, that's an example of a cryptic, Christological passage, a passage that Christianity ascribes Christological meaning, in other words, prophesying Christ, his first coming, but without really knowing Christian theology or Christian faith or the New Testament, no one reading that verse, having never read the New Testament, having never heard of Jesus, having never heard of the gospel, would get that from that verse. That's what I mean by a cryptic prophecy related to Jesus. Now, I'm saying that most prophecies in the Hebrew Bible that prophesy concerning Jesus' first coming are pretty cryptic, like that verse in Genesis, again, with the exception of Isaiah 53, which is in your face obvious to me, that it's talking about Jesus. It's very hard not to see that, okay? And I also mentioned Zechariah chapter 12. Now, the Christians, of course, accuse us, the Jews, of having this incredible blind spot for not seeing Jesus' first coming on the cross. Whereas I'll argue that the Christians themselves have a much more egregious, in your face blind spot as it relates to Jesus' second coming, okay? Because there are far more passages in the Bible, and they're not so cryptic, relating to the second coming of Jesus, or what most Jews are expecting in what they believe is going to be a first and only coming of the Messiah, this political king who rescues physical, ethnic Israel from our enemies and restores the very earthy kingdom of Israel to a place of primacy in God's economy. Okay? The Messiah must do those things. And if he doesn't do those things, then he's not the Messiah. And therefore, the only way a believer in Jesus can reconcile any of that is to believe that when Jesus comes in his second coming, he is going to fulfill all those things that we, the Jews, expected the Messiah to do in what Judaism believes to be the one and only coming of the Messiah. But the problem is that most of historical Christianity has waved off all those prophecies and basically said, well, they're not to be taken literally. They're only to be understood allegorically. What Jesus did in his first coming is all that he's doing, okay? And these people basically reject the notion of when Jesus returns, he sets up a millennial kingdom and a regathered Jewish state of Israel, ruling the world from Jerusalem for 1,000 years, which is what I believe, and I know most of you who follow me believe, okay? So we, the Jews, may have a blind spot concerning his first coming, and I mentioned in last week's episode or a couple weeks ago, there wasn't a single Jewish sect in Jesus' day looking for that suffering Messiah, that crucified Messiah. Not even one. Not the Pharisees, not the Sadducees, not the Essenes who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. No one else, okay? And this is what I believe Paul's referring to in part when he refers to the gospel as this mystery, okay? The mystery of the gospel. Paul struggled with this issue. How is it that the Messiah has come, but we, the Jews, don't recognize him, okay? And again, the reason why we didn't recognize him, part of the reason why we didn't recognize him is because he didn't do what hundreds of passages of the scripture says the Messiah will do when he comes. But of course, again, those of us who believe in Yeshua or Jesus believe it's only delayed. It's not that he's not going to do it. He is going to do it, but he's doing it in a second coming. Well, guys, that's quite a preface, okay? That's a long-winded but necessary preface to today's teaching. So let's jump into it, okay? The many messiahs of Israel. That's the name of this episode. Now, it may be just one episode, it may be two episodes, it may be more, okay? It's an important subject, and I want to cover it, and I don't know if I can cover it all in this one episode, but we're going to try. So I'm starting here in 1 Samuel chapter 8. And the irony is that this chapter 8 begins very similarly as the chapters we focused on last week concerning Eli and his two sons. For here we see an echo of that story, okay, from the get-go, regarding the corruption of Samuel's sons. Okay, so just like Eli's two sons were corrupt and brought the disfavor of God upon all of Israel, okay, therefore they lost the Ark of the Covenant in a battle that they lost to the Philistines because of that disfavor. Okay, here we see a repeat almost of this in the first line. So beginning with 1 Samuel chapter 8, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Wow. Okay, so almost a perfect parallel with Eli's sons. Now, the reason why I chose to begin here, and the reason why this is so important, is because this is the reason that's cited for the Israelites asking Samuel to give us a king. Okay, Samuel, give us a king. Now, in the verses I'm about to read, God looks with disfavor over this request for a king, but it didn't come out of nowhere. Okay, what's the impetus or the catalyst that causes the Israelites to ask Samuel to give us a king? The corruption of Samuel's two sons. It's that simple. The Israelites look at his sons and say, neither of these are worthy to lead us when you, Samuel, basically kicked the can, okay, when you pass away. So we need another ruler. We can't be ruled by your lineage. So give us a king like all the other nations, okay? And here it continues in verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. Now, the reason why this disappoints Samuel, as we would read if we were to continue throughout that whole chapter, is that God intended to rule the nation of Israel directly. Yahweh is the king of Israel, okay? In asking for an earthly king, God, through Samuel, is accusing the Israelites of rejecting him as king. Okay, but I still thought it was important to mention that the real catalyst for all of this was the corruption of Samuel's sons. So it didn't come out of nowhere. Now, we also read, not only do we want this king to be a judge over us, but also, if we were to continue throughout the whole chapter 8 here, it would refer to marching out before us in war. That's the two main jobs of the king of a ancient Near Eastern kingdom. Okay, what is the job of the ancient Near Eastern king, whether it be an Israelite king or one of our neighbors' kings? To march out before us and lead us in war, as well as to judge among the people. And if the king succeeds in those two things, to lead in war and righteously judge the people, well, then God says that he's a good king. But if the king fails in these two assignments, well, then he's typically written off as a failure, okay? These are the two things that are required of him. War, okay, leadership in war, and leadership as a righteous example and judge in ruling the people, okay? And in this case, the people, Israel. Okay, now we'll move on to a glimpse here from 1 Samuel chapter 9. And the reason why I'm going to read these few verses is to establish Saul's humility. Okay, Saul starts out as a very humble person. Now, he doesn't finish that way, okay? But it's important to get to Saul's origins here. Saul starts out very favorably with God. In fact, in just a few moments after this, it will say in one of the passages I'll read to you that basically God gave Saul a new heart. Okay, you could argue that Saul was a convert, that Saul came to know God personally. As we believe in the New Testament when it means, to get a new heart, to repent, to convert, to convert to a personal relationship with God. Okay, but I want to just establish here Saul's humility. So starting here in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel, verse 19. Now, if you remember, Saul was looking, the whole thing that started this meeting with Samuel is that Saul was looking for a couple donkeys belonging to his father Kish, who got lost. Okay, so the father sends Saul on the hunt for these lost donkeys. And while looking for them, Saul is told of the seer. Okay, this is what Samuel's called. He's not referred to here as a prophet, he's referred to as a seer. And he's told, if you go to the seer Samuel, he'll help you find your donkeys. Okay, but God had arranged this whole rendezvous, including the donkeys getting lost, to set up this rendezvous so that Samuel could have this fateful meeting with Saul, in which he would prophesy that Saul ultimately would become the king or first Messiah of the Jews. Okay, so here again, Samuel 9:19. Samuel answered Saul, I'm the seer. Go up before me to the high place, for today you shall eat with me, and in the morning I will let you go and will tell you all that is on your mind. As for your donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, do not set your mind on them, for they have been found. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for all your father's house? And Saul answered, Am I not a Benjaminite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me in this way? Okay, so here's Saul's humility. Now, of course, he's referring to the last 2 chapters of the book of Judges, which refer to a civil war between all the tribes of Israel against the one tribe of Benjamin. It's an amazing story. I actually read this in my own devotion time while I spent that week at Athey Creek or in Oregon. Okay, so this is, and I just remember being amazed. It had been years since I read that story, that an entire tribe of Israel had basically been extirpated, destroyed. Okay, and the only way this tribe would go on to survive, according to the story in the last couple chapters of Judges, was to kidnap some women from among the other tribes, okay, to take them as wives for this remaining few hundred men of Benjamin to try to reestablish the tribe of Benjamin. This is what Saul's referring to when he says, Am I not from the least of all the tribes of Israel? Okay, only a generation before his tribe Benjamin had been almost totally destroyed. And Saul is just fortunate to be one of the few survivors of that tribe of Benjamin. Okay, and the tribe of Benjamin would never fully recover, which is why in the days of Solomon's son Rehoboam, it basically, when all the tribes split off from Judah, Benjamin sort of sticks around as an adjunct of Judah. In other words, it's sort of like Judah with a little adjunct of little Benjamin that become, or let's say become the kingdom of Judah in name, and continue as that kingdom until the very end of that kingdom when Nebuchadnezzar destroys them, okay, in 586 BC. So Benjamin never fully recovers from what happened in those last couple chapters of the book of Judges. And that's what Saul's referring to here. Now, moving on to chapter 10 of 1 Samuel, this is the very first appearance in this context of the kings of Israel of the word Messiah, okay? And it comes in a verb form. Okay, so bear with me here and I'll explain that. Then, starting with verse 1 here of chapter 10, then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and said to him, Has not the Lord Messiahed you? That would be the verb, okay? Limshoach is the Hebrew verb, okay? Literally to Messiah someone or to anoint them, okay? Which is why it's not wrong to translate it into the English as anoint, okay? Has not the Lord Messiahed or anointed you to be prince over his people, and you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. So there we go. The very first appearance of the word, in this case, it's verbal form of Messiah, okay, to inaugurate this whole thing of the kings of Israel, starting with Saul, being the Messiah or chosen or literally anointed, okay, king for that time. Okay, now the story progresses to 1 Samuel chapter 10. And the passages I'm going to read to you refer basically to Saul. There's no other way that one would interpret this, okay? Undergoing a full conversion to Yahweh. In other words, not knowing Yahweh to now sort of knowing Yahweh. I mean, what else do you make from this, okay? Starting with verse 9 of chapter 10. When he, Saul that is, turned his back to leave Samuel, God gave him another heart. Wow. Okay. I mean, that sounds pretty much like a full on conversion here. And all these signs came to pass that day when they came to Gibeah, and behold, a group of prophets met him, that's Saul, and the Spirit of God rushed upon him, and he prophesied among them. And when all who knew him previously saw how he prophesied with the prophets, the people said to one another, "What has come over the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" Wow. Okay. A change of heart, the Holy Spirit coming upon him, and him prophesying among the school of prophets there. It's hard to argue here against the notion that Saul has undergone a full-on transformation, or what would be considered post-Christianity or post-New Testament, a conversion. Wow. Okay, now staying here in chapter 10, again, I just want to reestablish here Saul's humility. This is referring to the lottery, if you will, where Samuel brings all the tribes of Israel before him to reveal the chosen king to Israel at large. Now, Samuel already knew that Saul was the chosen king, but now this has to be publicly displayed to Israel at large. So how does he do it? He calls all the tribes to him. And God will basically call out Saul from among the tribes let's say from the tribe of Benjamin, from out of all the tribes of Israel, then from a certain clan out of the Saul of Benjamin, then to Kish's father, and to Saul himself. And where is Saul when basically his number is called, if you will, and he's basically to be publicly presented as the Messiah? He's hiding. Okay, he wants nothing to do with it. It says here, then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clan of the Matratites, wow, was taken by lot. And Saul the son of Kish was taken by lot. But when they sought him, they couldn't find him. So they inquired of the Lord, "Is there a man still to come?" And the Lord said, "Behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage." Then they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. Wow. Okay. So Saul has very humble beginnings, but also experiences a supernatural transformation of his heart. Okay. He couldn't have started out more favorably on the path of being Israel's first Messiah or chosen king. Now, as it relates to Messiah, the word now appears multiple times, okay, at least 2 times here in 1 Samuel chapter 12 in its more common noun form as opposed to its earlier verbal form from just a couple chapters ago. So I'm going to read it to you because we have to see this again, establishing that the king of Israel is considered to be the Messiah, okay? So here we are. Verse 1 of chapter 12. And Samuel said to all Israel, "Behold, I've obeyed your voice in all that you've said to me, and I've made a king over you. And now behold, the king walks before you, and I'm old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my youth until this day. Here I am, testify against me before the Lord and before his Messiah. Now, here in the ESV, it says anointed. Okay, but what's the Hebrew word that the word anointed is translated from? Mashiach, or Messiah. Okay, the literal word Messiah. So again, here I am, testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose donkey have I taken, or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you. And they said, you have not defrauded us, or oppressed us, or taken anything from any man's hand. And he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his Messiah, that's Saul, okay, standing off to the side listening to all this. The Lord is witness against you, and his Messiah, or anointed, is witness this day that you have not found anything in my hand. And they said, he is witness. So here in 1 Samuel chapter 12, now for the first time, Saul's being referred to by the noun Messiah, okay? God's Messiah, God's chosen king. Now, I'm obviously not going to read through several chapters with you today regarding Saul's life, but I'm just going to summarize a little bit here. It's important before we conclude this particular episode with 1 Samuel chapter 24. Okay, so what happens between 1 Samuel chapter 12 and the all-important, for concluding today's episode, 1 Samuel chapter 24? Well, Saul, who started out on the right foot, experienced a heart conversion to Yahweh, prophesied with the prophets. Eventually, he falls from God's favor. Why? Because he basically disobeys God's commandments. Now, the first one that I remember that he disobeys is when Samuel tells Saul, wait for me at Gilgal with the rest of Israel, and I will come down there to sacrifice for before the people. In other words, Samuel schedules a meeting with Saul at Gilgal. Gilgal is that area of the Jordan River, or by the Jordan River, where the Israelites cross with Joshua, the son of Nun, okay, a generation or so prior. And it's there that Samuel is going to conduct sacrifices. The problem is that Samuel is delayed, and Saul takes it upon himself as the king to now function in the form or in place of the priest. Okay, now in ancient Israel, there are clear, or let's say there is a clear delineation between priest and prophet and king. Okay, each one is to stay in their lane, but Saul does not stay in his lane. What does he do? He doesn't have the patience to wait for Samuel to come, and Saul offers up sacrifices in place of Samuel there in Gilgal, and in doing so is disobedient, okay? Disobedient to God's order of things. Now, the second thing that Saul does is Samuel, let's say this, God commands Saul to totally destroy a people group called the Amalekites. Okay, now to recall, the Amalekites back in the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, are the quintessential enemy of the Israelites. They get in the way of the Israelites. They're trying to keep the Israelites from making it into the promised land and to fulfilling their destiny. And therefore, the Amalekites fight a war against the Israelites back there in the 5 books of Moses. Okay, I think it's that famous war in which Joshua has to hold up the hands of Moses, if you remember. For as long as the hands of Moses were raised, the Israelites had a victory over the Amalekites. But when Moses' arms would tire and he'd let them down, the Amalekites gained the upper hand. Okay, The Amalekites go on to become, as I said just a minute ago, sort of like the metaphor for whoever is in a particular generation the apex enemy of the Jews. Okay, like the enemy that wants to wipe us off the face of the earth, whether that be the Nazis in World War II or the mullahs of the Islamic Republic of Iran today. Okay, the Amalekites are the first of a succession of these mortal enemies, and accordingly, and of course, this isn't popular with modern day scholars or readers of the Bible, God commands Saul and the Israelites to wipe these people out. Now, why did God command us to wipe these people out? Well, the answer is found typically by people who comment on the book of Esther, because if you don't wipe out the Amalekites, they will rear their head again to wipe us out. And it's believed that Haman, the viceroy of Persia in the book of Esther, who seeks to destroy the Jews, was a direct descendant of this king of the Amalekites, who Saul is guilty of having not killed. Okay, in other words, Saul's commanded to destroy every single Amalekite, to destroy their herds of sheep and goats, leave nothing of them. Okay, literally anything of them and nothing in name of them. And yet Saul, probably because of greed, allows the king of the Amalekites to live, okay, as well as their sheep and their herds of goats, okay, in order to distribute his war booty among the people. And Samuel shows up to the camp believing that he's going to be given a report that Saul obeyed and did what he was told to do. And instead, Samuel says, "What's this bleating of sheep I hear?" Okay, so Saul keeps the king of the Amalekites alive, as well as his herds of sheep and goats, who, again, they were all to be destroyed. And this was his second act of disobedience against God. Okay, and at this point, God shortly thereafter tells Samuel, "Samuel, I basically am taking leave of Saul. He no longer has my favor." For lack of a better word, God repents. Okay, now I'm not saying that that's the word that shows up here in the Bible. Okay, but God regrets Saul's being king of Israel. Why? Because Saul does not have a heart after the Lord's. But Steve, I thought you said several minutes ago that Saul experienced this incredible transformation of heart. That's what it said in the Bible, that he basically experienced a conversion and he was prophesying among the prophets. But now, Steve, you're saying that he fell out of favor with God and God's going to remove his hand from him. And God tells Samuel that he's going to pick a better person among Saul's peers who will have a heart after God, that being King David. Okay, that's how the story will develop. Now, it's interesting because of King David, who we'll take up in the next episode. It says that David had a heart after God. Okay, but David, of course, was no angel. Again, as we'll learn in the next episode, David was a murderer and an adulterer. Okay, and yet of that David, the Bible says he had a heart after God's own heart. Now, most Christians all believe that to mean that David, was strumming there on his harp and playing worship songs in his palace every day. Okay, that's how they interpret to have a heart after God. But I told Pastor Brett at the Prophecy Conference a couple of weeks ago that that's not really what it means in Hebrew, in the context of the Hebrew Bible, when it says of a king, he had a heart after God's. I'm not saying that David didn't love Yahweh, but what it really means is that David followed obediently what God would have him do. David carried out Yahweh's orders to him in a way that Saul did not. In other words, to have a heart after God in this context is to have a heart that's obedient to God. David would be obedient to God despite him being a murderer and an adulterer, whereas Saul, having prophesied among the prophets, you know, probably what these Pentecostals would say, speaking in tongues, okay? And yet he did not have a heart after God. He did not obey. Okay, that's what it means. So David would be anointed, and we're going to cover all that next week. David's selection as king over Saul. But Saul was, despite all his shortcomings, the very first Messiah of Israel. And I want to conclude this episode with an amazing story that each of our tour groups reads when we go to the site En-Gedi on a typical tour of Israel. Okay, En-Gedi is one of my favorite national parks in all of Israel. It's this oasis in the desert by a spring of water with herds of ibises, okay, or ibex in the singular, ibises in the plural, these mountain goats, these incredibly textile, agile, and I mean, it's just amazing and adorable, okay? Mountain goats. If you show up to En-Gedi as a tour group, let's say before it closes at around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, then you'll have a chance to see these wild goats. That's what En-Gedi means. En-Gedi literally means the spring of the goats. Okay, I'm going to read to you what took place there as I would read to you on a tour of Israel, because it's a great way to conclude this episode on the issue of the Messiah. Okay, the King of Israel as the chosen Messiah, even when he's backslidden here. So, starting here in 1 Samuel 24, verse 1. When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Okay, now for those of us who go to the actual site, I show you where we believe this cave is. The cave is right by En-Gedi's tallest waterfall, and that's very important because that waterfall is so loud when you're standing next to it or nearby it that it's hard to hear the person next to you when they're talking. In fact, in the era of guiding tours before we had these devices called whispers, okay, the whisper is this personal listening device that each of you are given on tour, your own earpiece, and I'm speaking into a broadcaster, and you're basically hearing me over radio waves, okay? Before the era of the whisper, you couldn't hear me at En-Gedi if I read this story right by that waterfall. The waterfall is too loud. For that reason, we read the story elsewhere, closer to the entrance of the park where it's quieter. Now, fortunately, since the advent of this technology or this product, the Whisper, now I can tell this story right by the waterfall because each of you, the tourist, has your own personal earpiece and you're able to raise the volume and it's speaking directly into your ear canal, your ear canal. Okay, so now we can, but it's so loud that in Saul's day, in the cave where we believe it was right by that waterfall, Saul wouldn't hear anybody near him, okay, walking near him, talking near him, nor would they hear Saul, all because of this waterfall nearby that would drown out any surrounding or ambient noises here. Okay, so that's important here, just to understand how neither David or Saul saw one another or heard one another. By the way, this cave is massive. It would have been dark. Now, since the story took place some 3,000 years ago, the ceiling of the cave has collapsed owing to earthquakes. And therefore, if we go to En-Gedi today, it's only a partial cave, the ceiling of which, or let's say the ceiling from Saul's day, is now in the form of boulders on the ground in front of the waterfall. Okay, so that's important. So picking it up again from verse 3 here. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And afterward, David's heart struck him because he cut off the corner of Saul's robe. And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, Yahweh's Messiah. Okay, that's what it says in Hebrew. Although here in the SV, as well as your Bible, it likely says the Lord's anointed. But what it really says in Hebrew is the Lord's Messiah, okay, or the Lord's Mashiach, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is, there it is again. This is like rapid fire here. Immediately, again, the Lord's Messiah. Okay, in this one verse, verse 6, it's mentioned twice. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Afterward, David also arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is Yahweh's Mashiach, or Messiah. That's the third time, okay? And we're only in verse 10 here. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand, for by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord avenge me against you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness. But my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog? After a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it, and plead my cause, and deliver me from your hand. As soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I've repaid you evil. And you've declared to me this day how you have dealt with me, in that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. Wow, what a appropriate chapter to end this episode, because here in this chapter, in this setting at En-Gedi, God's two messiahs, okay, what do you mean, Steve, two messiahs? Well, about a decade prior to this story, Samuel goes to Bethlehem and anoints David, the youngest son of Jesse, as Mashiach, as Messiah, while the other Messiah, Saul, is actively king of Israel. He's sitting on the throne. He hasn't expired yet. He hasn't reached his expiration date yet. Now, David's companions tempt him into believing that Saul has reached his expiration date, which is that very moment in the cave, while Saul is basically, for lack of a better term, squatting there and doing a number two in the cave nearby David and his men. Okay? But David does not do so. For David recognizes that even though Saul is backslidden, even though Saul is become evil, he's still God's Messiah or anointed. And only when God removes his Messiah can this Messiah in waiting, David, rightfully take his throne. So, wow, here we have the two Messiahs facing off with one another. And that's how we're going to conclude today's episode, okay? In the series in which we're exploring the subject of the Messiah, okay? We began with Saul, Israel's very first Messiah. In the next episode, we'll continue with David. And from David, probably I'll cover some of the history of the successive kings of Israel, but very briefly before I ultimately touch on the issue of Jesus. What does all this Messiah business, as it's being revealed to us in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, what's all that have to do with Jesus? Much in every way, especially his second coming. So with that, I'm going to conclude the episode. But I would be remiss if I didn't tell you, as I always do, that if you want to treat me to a cup of coffee, you can do so by way of my Ko-fi link, which I add to the extended description of each video below the video. Speaking of coffee, yesterday I took delivery of a new coffee machine, my coffee machine that I had had for something like 12 or 13, maybe 15 years. My DeLonghi finally broke, and I had to get a new coffee machine, which I got yesterday. The problem was when I wanted to use it for the first time today, the grinder that I had also for the last several years broke as well. So now I have a grinder that's scheduled to arrive this very day. Because I ordered it as early as 7:30 in the morning, I was promised it would arrive this very same day between 10 a.m. and 3 a.m. So I'm anticipating this new grinder so I can finally calibrate both the grinder and the new coffee maker so I can start enjoying cups of coffee. And thanks to you, I'm awash in coffee at the moment. I want to thank each of you for your generosity over the months. And thank you. Okay. Enjoy the weekend because there's few of these weekends left. The weather here is absolutely phenomenal. After a week of rain because of a hurricane that inched up the East Coast here. So I have a lot to do outside today. I'm going to hopefully get a lot of vitamin D out there in the sun. And I'm wishing you as well the best for the remainder of the weekend. This is Steve, the tour guide, signing off. Bye-bye.